What if I told you there's a new Strixhaven commander that lets you cast huge X-cost spells for barely any mana and only needs 1 blue mana to protect herself? Zimone Infinite Analyst. For 3 mana in Simic colors we get a very sturdy 0/4 human wizard. But more importantly, Zimone comes with 2 abilities that both interact with X-cost spells. And when combined together they can scale out of control really quickly. First up, whenever you cast your first spell with an X in its mana cost each turn, its cost will get reduced by 1 generic mana for each +1/+1 counter on Zimone. And as you probably can imagine, this already sets up for some incredible value, because every counter on Zimone essentially counts as 1 generic mana we can use towards our X spells. So the bigger Zimone gets, the cheaper all of our X spells will become, and the more value we'll be able to squeeze out of them. Now obviously, since we are in green and blue, we have a ton of ways to stack counters on our creatures. But the best part about Zimone is that we don't really even need those cards. And that is due to her second ability. Whenever you cast your first X-cost spell in a turn, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Zimone. Which means that just by doing what we already wanted to do, casting spells with an X in their cost, Zimone is naturally going to stack counters over the course of the game. Now both of these abilities are limited to once per turn. But in this deck we can easily bypass this restriction by casting X-cost instant speed spells during our opponent's turns. Which means that per turn cycle we can get up to 8 +1/+1 counters onto Zimone, and we will be able to use her cost reduction ability up to 4 times. 1 time during each player's turn. And once Zimone is online with a bunch of counters on her, you can start doing some absolutely disgusting things. You can cast huge X-cost creatures for barely any mana and make them enter as huge threats. You can play X spells with multiple X's in their costs which normally don't see any play, and we will be able to draw an absurd amount of cards of simple X-cost draw spells. Now I can already hear you thinking, but Panzer, this deck will just stop working if Zimone ever gets removed. And yes, you're totally right about that. That's why for this build I decided to do something different. There are a ton of counter spells that will cost you 1 blue mana plus X, and they will counter a spell unless the controller of that spell pays X amount of mana. And because of the way of how Zimone works, these spells become incredibly efficient. We can just drop our commander as early as turn 2, then start stacking counters on her, and we'll just only have to leave open 1 blue mana to cast a huge counter spell to protect her. And that is because the X cost in these counter spells will scale with the amount of +1/+1 counters on Zimone, making them act as hard counter spells for just 1 blue mana. On top of that, since we will be casting these counter spells during an opponent's turn, we even get to put an additional 2 counters on Zimone, scaling her up even further as a byproduct of protecting her. Now for this list, I decided to go with a really explosive build that is capable of doing some absolutely crazy things as early as turn 3 or turn 4. This is definitely one of the more complex builds I've done for the channel, and a lot of these synergies only start clicking together once you get a full picture. So I'd really recommend sticking around for the entire breakdown. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 7 categories: acceleration, protection and interaction, +1/+1 counter synergies, card draw, support, the X cost payoffs, and the lands. Let's start with the section that makes this deck as explosive as it is: the acceleration. These are the cards that will allow us to get Zimone on the battlefield as early as turn 2 before our opponents even have any answers ready. Let's kick things off by going over some of the more straightforward but easily the most important cards in the entire deck: a Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, a Fiendhorn Elves, Elvish Mystic, a Delighted Halfling, a Wild Growth, and a Soul Ring. All of these are 1 mana cards that will generate 1 mana, or 2 in the case of Soul Ring. And each of these will allow us to consistently play Zimone as early as turn 2. And I can't stress enough how incredibly important that is for this deck, because Zimone is one of those commanders that feels completely different to play depending on when you cast her. If you play her on curve on turn 3, the deck just feels fine, but if she does come out on turn 2, that's where things get really explosive. In fact, the best gameplay tip I can give you for this deck is that you always want at least one of these cards in your opening hand, and if you don't, you should seriously consider taking a mulligan, because these simple simple cards are what will enable your really strong starts and your early value explosions. And on top of that, they don't just help you early in the game. They will provide you with additional mana on your future turns, which will make it a lot easier to get your value pieces on the battlefield or dump even more mana into your X cost spells. And another card that will enable you to drop Zimone on turn 2 is a Burgeoning, a 1 mana enchantment that whenever any opponent plays a land will allow you to put one land from your hand straight on the battlefield. Now this is obviously an incredibly potent effect, because no matter what table you are playing at, one thing is for sure: people will always be playing lands. And this simple 1 mana enchantment can provide you with up to 3 additional land drops per turn cycle. And if you get really lucky and you have 4 lands and a Burgeoning in your opening hand, you can just play this card on turn 1, and by the time it's your turn again and you get to your second turn, you will have a total of 4 lands on the battlefield, which is just absolutely insane. Now the reason I did decide to include a Burgeoning in this deck is simply due to the fact that this deck can draw an absurd amount of cards, which means that we will always have a huge amount of spare lands available in our hands, and a Burgeoning will provide us with a huge amount of mana acceleration over the course of the game. And our first X drop card is a Sporocyst. For 1 green mana and double X, we get a defender creature that will enter the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it. And whenever it does enter the battlefield, we get to search our library for X basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Now first up, this is already a really solid effect to play on turn 3 once you already have Zimone on the battlefield, because it will accelerate your mana by fetching up a basic land, and it will also put those 2+1/+1 counters on Zimone, really kickstarting our counter stacking process. And if you do draw into this creature later in the game, it can fetch you up like 3, 4, 5 basic lands for just 1 green mana thanks to Zimone's cost reduction, which will give you an incredible amount of mana acceleration while also filtering all of the lands out of your deck and making sure you don't draw into any lands in the late game. And the way these double X cost cards work with Zimone is as follows. Whenever you cast this card, you have to declare the mana value of the X's. For simplicity's sake, let's say you want to cast this creature with X being 3. Then the total cost of the spell will be calculated and it will be equal to 7 because you do have 3 in both of the X's. After all of that has happened, then any cost reduction will apply. Let's say you then have 6 counters on Zimone, the total cost of 7 mana will be reduced by 6 mana, allowing you to cast this creature for just 1 green mana. Open the way. For 2 green mana plus X, you get to reveal the top cards of your library until you hit X land cards, and then you get to put all of the revealed land cards onto the battlefield tapped. This card has some sort of a built-in limitation that X can be greater than the number of players in the game, so the maximum cost of X can only be 4. And just like the previous card, you will be able to cast a spell on turn 3 with X being 1, which will accelerate your mana and start the counter stacking on your Zimone, whilst later in the game, once Zimone is online, you will be able to fetch 4 lands with this spell for just 2 green mana, which is some incredible value. Analyst's Awakening. For 1 green mana plus X, you get to reveal the top X cards of your library, and any amount of land cards revealed this way will go to the battlefield tapped. Now, unlike the previous cards, this effect doesn't actually guarantee you land drops, and it is some sort of a gamble if you do cast it with a low X cost. Because let's say you cast this early in the game with X being 4, you can either get extremely unlucky and don't hit any lands making this spell do nothing, or you can get really lucky and hit 4 lands of this effect and get some ridiculous value. But where this card really shines is the late game. Once you have a bunch of counters on your Zimone, you will be able to dump a huge amount of mana into the X, which will then translate in you getting like 5 to 10 lands onto the battlefield for free. This card also has the spell mastery mechanic, meaning whenever you cast it and you already have 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, those lands will enter the battlefield untapped. And honestly, this is a really easy requirement to meet because we are playing a total of 29 instant and sorceries in this deck, making this card act as some sort of a giga ritual effect, just putting a ton of untapped lands straight onto the battlefield. And the last card in this section is an Astral Cornucopia, a triple X artifact that will enter the battlefield with X charge counters on it, and it can be tapped to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool for each charge counter. Now already by itself, this card is a totally fine 3 mana Rock. But once again, this card has a perfect synergy with both of Zimone's abilities. You can play this card on turn 3 after you cast your Zimone on turn 2, which will give you a trigger of her ability and put 2 +1/+1 counters on her. And more importantly, since this card is an artifact and doesn't have Summoning Sickness, we can then instantly tap it for 1 blue mana, which, as you will see in the next section, is exactly what we need to make sure we can protect Zimone on that crucial turn 3. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. This is honestly the section that makes this entire build work and what makes it so incredibly unique. Instead of relying on traditional protection, we are using X-cost counter spells. And let's start off with the most basic version of the spells I'm talking about. Clash of Wills. For 1 blue mana plus X, we get to counter a target spell unless its controller pays X mana. And let me just give you an example of how strong these spells are early in the game. Let's say you play the Mana Dork on turn 1, Zimone on turn 2, and you now have 4 mana available on turn 3. You can then during your turn play any X-cost card with a total mana value of 3 like a Sporocyst. You will get to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto your Zimone and you will still have 1 blue mana untapped. You can then just pass the turn to one of your opponents and let's say they are trying to cast an Assassin's Trophy targeting your Zimone. You can then just cast your Clash of Wills for the 1 blue mana and they will have to pay an additional 2 generic mana or the spell will get countered. Since the opponent is only on their turn 3 with 3 lands available, they won't be able to pay the cost and the spell will get countered, which will result in your Zimone surviving the removal spell and at the same time also getting 2 additional +1/+1 counters because you cast the spell with an X in its cost. Like I mentioned, all of these spells will both protect her and scale her up at the same time, making them incredibly valuable. And obviously later in the game, once you do have like 8 counters on your commander, all of these spells will act as 1 mana hard counters, because the cost reduction that Zimone will give to the X cost will make it nearly impossible for your opponents to ever pay for it. Condescend, a card with exactly the same effect as the previous card, but on top of that, whenever we cast it, we also get to scry too. So not only do we get to protect our commander and scale her up, at the same time we also get to manipulate the top cards of our library and set up our future draws. Power Sink, another 1 mana X-cost counter spell, but this time whenever we cast it, if an opponent can't pay the additional cost, we also get to tap all of their mana producing lands, which against some really specific decks can be absolutely brutal. Because let's say an opponent is planning to cast a sorcery based removal spell and then follow up with a big win con creature. Whenever they now cast a removal spell, we can just counter it with a Power Sink, all of their lands will be tapped and they won't be able to drop their big threat. Spectral Denial, a card that is basically a Clash of Wills with a slight little benefit attached to it, and that is that its cost will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each creature we control with power 4 or greater. Now I can guarantee you that you will always have at least 1 creature that will meet this criteria, being your commander, because she will always have a huge amount of counters on herself, which will essentially always increase the X cost of the spell by at least 1. Syncopate, exactly the same effect as the previous ones, but this time whenever we do counter a spell, instead of going to the graveyard, it will go to exile instead, making it really efficient against sacrifice strategies that are trying to cast their Gravecrawler from their graveyard over and over again, while also completely shutting down any card with a flashback effect. For example, that Ishin player who is trying to resolve their Seize the Day and get 2 uses out of it. And the best X-cost counterspell in this entire deck is a Spell Burst, and that is due to this card having the buyback mechanic, meaning that whenever you cast it, you get the option to pay 3 additional colorless mana and it will, instead of going to the graveyard, just return to your hand. And the buyback mechanic actually has a really crazy synergy with our commander, because let's say you do want to cast a spell with the buyback mechanic and the X being 4. The total cost of this spell will now be 1 blue mana and 7 generic mana. If you then have at least 7 counters on your Zimone, she will also reduce the cost of the buyback mechanic, allowing you to cast a spell for just 1 mana. Then it will just return to your hand, and this card does set up for some sort of a soft lock on your opponents, because for as long as you do have the counters on your Zimone and the 1 blue mana to pay for the spell, you can just keep casting it over and over again, just countering anything that your opponents are trying to do. Repeal, for 1 blue mana and X, you get to bounce any non-land permanent with mana value X or less to its owner's hand. Now once you do have a bunch of counters on your Zimone, this card essentially reads pay 1 blue mana, bounce bounce anything, allowing you to deal with any problematic enchantment, artifact, or creature. And this card is also a cantrip, because whenever you cast it, you get to draw a card, essentially making it replace itself, turning this into an excellent filler card to cast during an opponent's turn, just ruining their tempo and getting 2 additional counters onto your Zimone. March of Swirling Mist, an X cost spell that will make up to X target creatures phase out. Phasing out basically means that those creatures won't exist until their controller's next upkeep. And a really nice thing is that whenever you do phase out a creature that had counters on it, it will just return to the battlefield with all of its counters intact, making it into an incredible protection tool you can use to just phase out your Zimone, making her uninteractable, and when she does phase in again, she will still have all her counters and no value will be lost. And phasing out can also be used offensively, because let's say your opponents do control 5 creatures, you can then just cast this card for 1 blue mana thanks to Zimone's cost reduction, phase out all of their creatures, and your opponents won't have any blockers left, and you will be able to swing for a huge amount of damage. And a really similar card is Change of Plans, which you will always be able to cast for just 1 blue mana thanks to Zimone's cost reduction, and up to X target creatures you control get to connive. Connive basically means that you get to draw a card and then discard a card. If the card you discarded was a non-land, you get to put an additional +1/+1 counter on the conniving creature, already giving you a way to dig a little deeper into your library and get an additional counter on your Zimone. And after your creatures did connive, they will phase out, which, just like a March of the Swirling Mist, is an excellent way to protect both your Zimone and your value creatures from spot removal or board wipes. The main difference being that you can only use a spell to target your own creatures, and you can't use it in an offensive way to phase out any blockers. Tyvar's Stand. For 1 green mana +X, you get to give target creature +X/+X until the end of turn, and it will also gain both hexproof and indestructible. Now first up, you can just cast this card for the 1 green mana to get a protection effect onto your Zimone to protect her from being removed by a Path to Exile or a Damnation. But later in the game, you can also invest a huge amount of mana into the X and give a huge power boost to one of your trample creatures, and you will really be able to catch your opponents off guard with the surprise damage they will take, because this is an instant speed spell. Curse of the Swine. For 2 blue mana +X, we get to exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller will get to generate a 2/2 board token. Yeah, this card is just absolutely cracked in this deck, because thanks to our commander, we will always be able to pump a huge amount of mana into the X, and usually this will just function as a one-sided board wipe, just pinpoint exiling any problematic creature that your opponents might have on the battlefield. And the fact that this card is some exile-based removal even allows you to deal with some indestructible creatures your opponents might control. Repulsive Mutation. For 2 mana +X, we get to put X+1/+1 counters on target creature we control. Then we get to counter target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power amongst creatures we do control. The first part of the ability acts as some sort of a counter doubler, because let's say you already have 6 counters on your Zimone, this spell's cost will then be reduced by 6 mana, just giving her 6 additional counters, while at the same time also allowing you to counter anything your opponents might be throwing at you. And I mean, what more could you want from a card in this deck, both scaling up your commander like crazy and giving you a way to protect her. Dominate. For 2 blue mana, this card will allow us to gain control of any creature on the battlefield with mana value X or less. Now obviously, since we are in Simic colors, we don't have access to that many removal spells, but thanks to Zimone's massive cost reduction, we will be able to cast this card for just 2 mana and steal anything that our opponents might control, which is a lot better than actually removing it. You can steal your opponent's Elesh Norn, there's Cute Swarm before it is even online, and you can even use this effect to steal someone's commander, which for as long as it doesn't get removed and it stays on your side of the battlefield will prevent your opponents from accessing their commander. And the last card in this section is a Distorting Wake. For 3 blue mana +X, you get to bounce up to X non-land permanents, and this is just the perfect card to cast in the mid game once you have a bunch of counters on your Zimone. You can just specifically target any big creatures, any commanders, or any problematic enchantments or artifacts your opponent opponents might have on the battlefield, which will totally destroy their tempo because they will have to invest the mana and cast all of it again, and their boards will be empty and you will be able to get a huge swing in with your massive Zimone. Next up we have our +1/+1 Counter Synergies. While Zimone naturally stacks counters on ourselves, these cards will help us accelerate that process, allowing us to scale our cost reduction even faster and push Zimone to our absolute limits. Elusive Otter. Now while this is a really cute creature, the only thing we really care about is the adventure part, that for 1 green mana plus X will allow us to put X +1/+1 counters on creatures we control. A fantastic effect you can cast as early as turn 3 to both get a free Zimone trigger and get some additional counters on her, and later in the game you can use this effect to double up on the counters that Zimone already has on herself for just 1 green mana. Oh, and by the way, if you really do like otters, I also have a muddle video on the channel you can go check out. Broodguard Elite, a creature that will enter the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on itself, and whenever it leaves the battlefield you get to put those counters onto another creature you control. Now while this might seem like a horrible effect since we don't have a reliable way to make it leave the battlefield and redistribute its counters onto our Zimone, we can use it in exactly the same way as an elusive otter thanks to its warp mechanic, meaning that we can just cast it for 1 green mana plus X, and at the end of the turn it will leave the battlefield and go to exile, giving us an additional 1 mana spell that will essentially double up on the counters that Zimone already has, and on a later turn we can just cast it again from exile for 2 green mana plus X thanks to the warp mechanic, essentially giving us 2 uses out of this card. Blitzball Stadium, a fantastic card for what we're trying to do in this deck that I didn't see in any other Zimone list. It's a 1 blue mana artifact that whenever it enters a battlefield will allow us to support X, meaning that we get to put 1 +1/+1 counter on up to X creatures we control. Now already by itself this is the perfect card to play on turn 3 to get a free Zimone trigger, get an additional counter on her, and make sure you still have some mana open to protect her. But the main reason this card is included is its activated ability. For 3 mana and tapping it, we get to give a creature we control an additional ability until the end of turn. Whenever it does deal combat damage to an opponent, we get to draw a card if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, and most importantly, it will also make the creature unblockable. You can then just use this effect in the late game to either get a huge hit in with one of your creatures or deal a massive amount of commander damage with your Zimone, while even drawing you a card when you do so. Benevolent Hydra, a 2 mana creature that will enter the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on itself, which will give you a massive body in the late game once your cost reduction is online, and it's also a really good creature to drop on turn 3 with just 1 mana into the X. And that is because this creature also has a Hardened Scales effect attached to itself. Whenever you'd put any amount of counters on any creature you control, they will get that many +1 instead, giving your Zimone 3 counters per trigger, additional value from any counter-stacking cards like your Blitzball Stadium or your Elusive Otter, and also scaling perfectly with its own tap ability that will allow you to remove 1 counter from this creature and put 2 +1/+1 counters on any creature you control, giving you an extra way to get additional counters onto your commander. Strength of the Tajuru, a card that will put X +1/+1 counters on any creature we control, and it also has the multi-kicker ability, meaning whenever we cast it we get the option to pay 1 additional generic mana, and for each time we do so we get to put those counters onto an additional creature. You can use this in exactly the same way as an Elusive Otter, just targeting your Zimone and getting additional counters on her, or in the late game you can use this card to give a massive stat boost to your entire board, because let's say you do have 5 creatures on the battlefield and 10 counters on your Zimone. You can then pay 2 green mana, pump 5 mana into the X of this cost, and pay 5 mana for the multi-kicker ability. The total cost of this spell will then be 2 green mana and 10 generic mana. Zimone's cost reduction will then apply, and for just 2 green mana you get to put 5 +1/+1 counters on all 5 of your creatures, making this into one of the most potent win condition cards in the entire deck. And now that we're on the topic of win conditions, we're also playing a Colonian Hydra, which is a 5 mana creature that will enter with 4 +1/+1 counters on itself. Whenever we attack with this creature, we get to double the amount of counters on each creature we control. Now this card can already win you the game all by itself if your opponents have no way to deal with it. The first time you swing you will deal 8 damage, 16, 32, 64, yeah. Especially thanks to this card having trample, you will always get a ton of damage through. And as you've seen in the previous section, we are running this many protection tools that we will be able to make sure this card sticks to the battlefield. Now, outside of being a really solid win condition all by itself, it will also double up the counters on our Zimone and any other counter creature we control, making this into one of the strongest creatures in the entire deck. If you're enjoying these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. All members will gain early access to the deck lists, exclusive Discord chat rooms where I'm always sharing what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. Seeing more and more of you joining the membership program really does mean a lot to me. It's thanks to you that I'm able to put this amount of effort into these weekly deck tech videos, so thank you. Next up we have the card draw. These are the spells that will allow us to turn Zimone's massive cost reduction into an absurd amount of card advantage and make sure we never run out of gas. Ingenious Prodigy, a 1-mana creature that will enter the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on itself. And at the beginning of your upkeep you get to remove one counter from this creature to draw one card. Another really small X cost creature we can cast as early as turn 3 to get a Zimone trigger and leave the mana open to protect her, while at the same time also functioning as some sort of a small little cantrip. Because if you cast this card with X just being 2, over time this card will return 2 cards to you. And if later in the game you do have ways to put additional counters on it, either with a Benevolent Hydra or a Strength of the Tajuru, it will provide you with some additional draw. Hydroid Crazes, a 2-mana X-cost creature that will enter with X counters and also has both flying and trample. And whenever you cast this massive jellyfish Hydra beast, you also get to draw half X cards and gain half X life, rounded down. And I mean, what more can you want from a creature in this deck? Whenever you do cast this in the late game with Zimone's massive cost reduction, you will get to draw a huge amount of cards, gain a big chunk of life, and you will get a massive evasive beater on the battlefield. Wan Shi Tong, hands down one of the strongest cards we got released in 2025, which has a really similar ability to the previous card. Whenever it enters a battlefield, it will enter with X+1/+1 counters and we get to draw half X cards, rounded down, already giving us a huge amount of card draw and a big body we can start beating our opponents with. But on top of that, it also has a really crazy passive ability. For as long as this creature is on the battlefield, whenever any opponent searches their library, we get to put a counter onto this creature and we also get to draw cards. And you'd actually be surprised by the amount of times that players are searching their library in a game of Commander. Whenever they use any tutor spell, they cast a simple acceleration spell like a Farseek searching for a land, and even if you are playing at some higher power tables, whenever an opponent is cracking a fetch land, you will get to draw a card and you will get a counter, just giving you an incredible amount of extra card advantage and a scaling body that will just get bigger over the course of the game. And thanks to this creature even having the flash mechanic, we will be able to cast it during an opponent's turn and guarantee us one additional Zimone trigger during a turn cycle. Now obviously a card this strong does come with quite a hefty price tag. If you do head over to the decklist on Moxfield and click the primer button, I've also included a list of budget alternatives if you don't want to spend like 50 euros on a single card. Terra Symbiosis, a 3-mana enchantment that whenever we would put 1 or more counters on a creature we control, we get to draw that many cards. And just like Zimone, this ability will only trigger once per turn. But just like I explained during the intro, since we are playing this many instant speed X-cost spells and we want to be casting during our opponent's turns, it will be really easy for us to bypass this restriction. Terra Symbiosis basically reads, whenever you now get a Zimone trigger and put 2 counters on her, you will also get to draw 2 cards, which essentially means the simple 3-mana enchantment can provide us with up to 8 additional cards every single turn cycle. Next up we have some non-permanent card draw spells, and let's start off with the most basic one, Stroke of Genius. For 3 mana plus X we get an instant speed spell that will make target player draw X cards. And cards like this are exactly what Zimone is all about, because she pushes their value absolutely through the roof. Because let's say you do have 8 counters on her, you will be able to draw 5 new cards for 1 blue mana, which is some absolutely incredible value. And thanks to this card being an instant speed spell, we will be able to cast it during an opponent's turn and get even more counters on our Zimone. And a card with a really similar effect is Pull from Tomorrow. This spell will have a base cost of 2 blue pips and will also draw us X cards. But after we did that, we will also have to discard 1 card. Yeah, if you are casting this spell for 10 mana, it won't even matter, you have to discard 1 and it will allow you to dig really deep into your library. Drown in Dreams. A next spell we will usually be able to cast for just 1 blue mana and it will allow us to pick 1 out of its 2 options. The first option is exactly the same effect as a Stroke of Genius, making target player draw X cards, while the second option will make target player mill twice X cards. Now, while just having access to a second copy of a Stroke of Genius is already really solid, the best part about this card is that whenever you do control your commander, you get to pick both options. And while obviously you can use this as a really potent card draw spell for yourself, you can actually also use it as an alternate win con for this deck. Because let's say you go really late into the game and you have a bunch of mana available and a huge amount of counters on your Zimone. If you're then able to cast a spell with X being like 25 and target both effects at one opponent, they will have to mill 75 cards and by the time it's their turn again, they will just lose the game. Mind into Matter, a new Strixhaven card that for 2 mana plus X will allow us to draw X cards, and then we get to put any permanent card from our hand with mana value X or less straight onto the battlefield. Now, while this card does come with the downside that it can only be cast on sorcery speed, it does come with the upside that we do get to cheat a permanent into play for free, generating us some really solid tempo. Now, sadly, this effect doesn't really scale all that well with all of our X-cost creatures, because if you, for example, want to put a Hydroid Krasis into play with this effect, it will enter with 0 counters and it will just instantly die. That being said, you will be able to use this effect to get any of our value enchantments you will see in a later section into play for free, or you can even use its effect to just get an additional land into play, accelerating your mana. Tassa's Intervention. The first option will allow us to look at the top X cards of our library and put 2 of them in our hands. While this effect won't draw you a crazy amount of cards like a Stroke of Genius with a huge amount of mana into the X, it will allow you to dig really deep into your deck and make sure you get the 2 specific cards you need most at the current given board state. And the second option on this card makes it function as one of the counter spells I was talking about earlier, allowing you to counter any spell unless its controller pays twice X mana, making it into either a really efficient card draw spell or a really efficient counter spell. Flash of Insight. For 2 blue mana plus X, you get to look at the top X cards of your library and put 1 of those into your hand. Now, while this might seem pretty horrible comparing this to the previous card draw spells that I mentioned, it's actually one of the better cards in this deck, and that is due to its flashback mechanic. You can just cast a spell on turn 3, drawing you 1 card and getting the counters rolling on your Zimone, and on a later turn, if you do have 2 mana left, you can just flashback this card during an opponent's turn, and since the original cost does have an X in it, it will actually give you a Zimone trigger, giving you a really easy way to get additional counters onto your Zimone during your opponent's turns. And the big daddy of all X-cost card draw spells is a Finale of Revelation, which just like the previous cards will allow us to draw X cards whenever we cast it. But whenever we cast a spell and the value of X is 10 or more, we do get some incredible additional effects. We get to shuffle our entire graveyard into our library, which will recur any value pieces we lost over the course of the game. It will untap 5 of our lands, just giving us access to a ton more resources to cast instant speed X-cost spells during our opponent's turns. And my favorite bit is that this card will give us no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. And as you've seen with all of the card draw spells we are playing, this effect is actually quite relevant, because in the late game this effect will essentially enable you to play with like 20 or 30 cards in your hand, just making sure you do have an answer available for anything your opponents might throw at you. Next up, we have our support cards, and these are the pieces that bring this entire strategy together. Whether they bring us additional value, recursion, or help us close out the game, these cards make the deck run a lot smoother. Engineered Explosives, a simple X-cost artifact that is some secret tech for Zimone, because whenever you do drop your commander on turn 2, you can just follow up with this artifact for 0 mana, already kickstarting Zimone with 2 counters from as early as turn 2, which will enable some really crazy turn 3 plays. And even though this artifact will then enter the battlefield with 0 counters on itself, you will still be able to get a huge amount of value of its activated ability, because because for 2 mana and sacrificing this card, you get to destroy each non-creature card with a mana value equal to the counters on it. And even though that value will always be 0, it does have a huge amount of applications. You can use this to destroy any creature tokens on the battlefield, just ruining a token player's day, and if you are playing against a treasure or a food tech, it will even destroy all of those tokens. Mana Bloom, a really old card that barely saw any play, but Zimone really gave some new life to it. For 1 green mana plus X, you get an enchantment that will enter the battlefield with X charge counters on it, and once per turn you can remove 1 charge counter from this card to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which is already a really good effect, because if we are able to get a couple of charge counters onto this card, we will have 1 blue mana available during each of our opponent's turns, and it will then be really easy to cast one of our X cost counter spells and protect our Zimone. But the best part is that whenever you do get to your upkeep and this card has no charge counters on it, it just returns to your hand, enabling you to cast it again during your turn and guaranteeing you that you have a card to cast to get an additional Zimone trigger. Now, a good thing to know about this card is that you never want to cast it with X being more than 4, because by the time it's your turn again, you always want to be able to return this to your hand, and it only happens if it has 0 charge counters on it. And it's also a really good card you can cast for just 1 green mana, not investing anything into the X, to give you a free Zimone trigger, and it will just return to your hand on the next turn anyways. Green Sun Zenith. For 1 green mana plus X, we get to search our library for any green creature card with mana value X or less and put it straight onto the battlefield. Now, the main reason this card is included in the deck is because it does give us an additional way to get Zimone out on turn 2. On the first turn of the game, you can just drop any land that produces a green mana. You can then cast your Green Sun Zenith for 0, and you can actually use it to go fetch up a Dryad Arbor, which is a land creature that functions in exactly the same way as a forest and will make sure you have 3 mana available on your second turn. Now, outside of that interaction, cards that tutor directly to the battlefield aren't actually all that great in this deck, because most of our X-cost creatures will enter the battlefield with 0 counters on them and they will just instantly die. But there is one specific card that is a really good target for this, being your Colonian Hydra, that whenever you do have at least 5 counters on your Zimone, you will be able to tutor to the battlefield with a Green Sun Zenith for just 1 green mana. Wildest Dreams. For 1 green mana and double X, you get to return any amount of cards from your graveyard to your hand. And since we don't really have any way to recur our value creatures or any of our spells if they either got removed or they did get milled, I did need to include at least one form of recursion in this deck. And what's a better fit for Zimone than an X-cost recursion card? Usually whenever you cast this, you will be able to return like 3 or 4 specific cards to your hand, and you will then just be able to cast them again, either making your opponents deal with your creatures once more, or just getting additional uses of some of the biggest and meanest non-permanent X-cost spells in this deck. And probably the meanest X-cost spell of them all, Doppelgang, which has an insane triple X in its mana cost, but the effect is absolutely crazy. For each of X target permanents, we get to create X token copies of it. And let me just give you a couple of examples of how crazy this effect can get. Let's say you are able to dump a total of 9 mana into the X, making X equal to 3. Example 1. Let's say you are playing against a landfall player and they do have a Skewed Swarm and a Field of the Dead on the battlefield. You can then just cast this card and get 3 copies of Field of the Dead, 3 copies of Skewed Swarm, and then for the last target you can just pick any regular land. All of these tokens will enter the battlefield at exactly the same time, and all of their ETB triggers will see each other entering, which will result in you getting 1,000,000 zombies and 70 gazillion insect tokens. Example 2. Let's say you are playing against some sort of a burn midrange deck. You can target their Twin Flame Tyrant, their Impact Tremors, and their Siege Gang Commander. Thanks to you now having 3 Twin Flame Tyrants, you will get a total damage multiplication of 8. All of the Siege Gang Commanders entering the battlefield will generate you a bunch of Goblin tokens, and all 3 copies of the Impact Tremors will see all of these tokens entering and will deal a gazillion damage to the entire table. This is by far one of my personal favorite big X-cost spells to cast in the entire deck. The options truly are endless. Lattice Library, an enchantment for 2 green mana that will enter the battlefield with X study counters on it. And whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield and we cast our first X-cost spell in a turn, we get to create a 0/0 fractal token with X +1/+1 counters on itself. And this enchantment is actually one of the main win conditions for this deck, because you can just do what you're about to do anyways, and that is just casting X spells during each player's turn. And if you then were able to cast this card with a huge amount of study counters, it will generate you up to 4 massive creature bodies every single turn cycle, just rewarding you with a massive board state. And since all of these creature tokens will have a huge amount of counters on them, they do synergize perfectly with your Colonian Hydra, just doubling up their stats every single turn. Ride the Avalanche, a 2-mana instant speed spell that will give the next spell we cast this turn the flash mechanic, meaning that we can cast it on instant speed. And whenever we do follow up with another spell, we get to put X +1/+1 counters on target creature we control, X being the total mana value of that spell. Now in this deck, I can't stress enough how important it is that we can cast things during our opponent's turns, because every time we do so, we will get an additional Zimone trigger and additional cost reduction. And this spell just enables us to do so while also scaling perfectly with Zimone's cost reduction, because you can just cast this card for 2 mana and give flash to like your Curse of the Swine. If you then cast that spell for like 10 mana thanks to Zimone's cost reduction, you will also get to put an additional 10 counters on your commander, which will set you up for a really explosive next turn. And now that we're on the topic of giving flash to all of our spells, Final Word Phantom, a 3 mana flash flying creature that during our opponent's end steps allows us to cast any spell in our hand with the flash mechanic, essentially functioning in exactly the same way as a High Fate Trickster or a Veldalken Orrery, but for 1 mana less, allowing us to just leave our mana open and really surprise our opponents, while also making it really easy to cast a spell during each opponent's turn and get those 4 Zimone triggers per turn cycle. Neff, the Practical Dean. Whenever we cast our first X cost spell during a turn, we also get to put X +1/+1 counters onto this creature, giving us a creature body that will just scale bigger and bigger over the course of the game, and eventually your opponents will have to deal with it or they will just be taken out of the game by him. And the best part about this card is its passive ability, which will give trample to all of your creatures that do have a counter on them, synergizing really well with his own ability that will grow him into an absolutely massive body over the course of the game. It will allow you to deal huge amounts of commander damage with your Zimone, giving trample to all your creatures you just stack 10 counters on with your Strength of the Tajuru, and also giving trample to the massive army of fractal tokens you did generate with your Lattice library, because it doesn't matter having 10 50 power creatures on the board for as long as your opponents have 1/1 creatures they can chum block them with, and trample totally solves that problem. Spellseeker, a 3 mana wizard that whenever it enters a battlefield will allow us to search our library for any instant or sorcery card with mana value 2 or less. And since whenever calculating the total converted mana cost for any X spell only takes into account the actual colored pips, we can use this creature to tutor up any spell in the deck. If you want to set up for a game win, you can go tutor up your Lattice library or your Doppelgang. You can use it to go fetch up any X cost card draw spell in the deck, or if you do know an opponent is about to cast a board wipe on the next turn, you can just go tutor up any of your counter spells and make sure you do have an answer ready. Unbound Flourishing, a 3 mana enchantment that has 2 passive abilities that will just amplify the value of any X cost spell you cast through the roof. First up, whenever we cast any permanent spell with X in its mana cost, we will get to double the value of X, doubling up the size and the card draw of our Wan Shi Tong, giving us double the amount of counters on our Lattice library, and even doubling the amount of lands that Ursporocyst will fetch for us. While the second ability of this card, whenever we cast any instant or sorcery with an X in its cost, will just copy that spell, doubling the card draw of our Stroke of Genius, getting a huge amount of additional lands from our Animist's Awakening, and my favorite part, you will get some absolutely insane value when you cast a Doppelgang. Just a fantastic enchantment that will double the value of anything that we're doing in this deck. And a card with a really similar effect is an Owling Spiralmancer, a 4 mana creature that whenever we cast our first X cost spell in a turn will just copy that spell. If we cast any creature like a Benevolent Hydra, we will just have 2 Benevolent Hydras entering the battlefield. And if we do, for example, cast a non-creature spell like a Wildest Dreams, we will just get an additional copy on the stack and we will gain double the value. The main difference between this card and an Sunbound Flourishing is that it will only trigger once per turn. But like I mentioned, since we will usually be casting during our opponent's turn to get Zimone's cost reduction, that usually doesn't really matter. Next up, we have our X cost payoffs. Now while you already saw a lot of X cost cards throughout the entire deck, these are cards that will allow us to turn Zimone's cost reduction into actual pressure on our opponents. Stone Coil Serpent, an artifact creature that will enter the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on itself, and it has a really solid set of keywords. It has reach, meaning you can use it to block a flying commander like a Kalia or an Aurelia. It has trample, meaning that whenever you do cast it for a huge X cost, you will always get combat damage through. And most importantly, it also has protection from multicolored, meaning that your opponents can target this with things like an Abrupt Decay or an Assassin's Trophy, and whenever your opponents only control multicolored creatures, you can use this as some sort of an unblockable beatstick. Gold Vein Hydra, another X cost creature that will enter with X counters and also has some really good keywords, being Vigilance, Trample and Haste, meaning that whenever this does hit the battlefield and you invested a huge amount of mana into the X, it will have an immediate impact, guarantee that it can get combat damage through, and you will even be able to use it as a massive blocker. And the best part about this card is that whenever it dies, we get to generate X treasure tokens, X being equal to its power, which makes this into a really good creature you can cast for a small X cost to get some free counters on Zimone, and whenever it does get killed, it will give you some free acceleration. And in the late game, if you do cast it as like a 10 power creature, your opponents will eventually have to deal with it. And when they do, you will get a massive amount of treasure tokens. In return, you can invest into the X cost of your next spells. Kinetic Ooze, a creature that whenever it enters the battlefield, depending on the mana value of X, will have some different effects. First up, you get to destroy target artifact or enchantment with mana value X or less, giving you a really good way to deal with problematic cards like an Aura Shards, a Smothering Tide or a Rhystic Study. If the X was 5 or more, this creature will also draw you a card, essentially replacing itself. And where the money's at is whenever you are able to invest 10 or more mana into the X, because whenever it then enters the battlefield, you get to pick any amount of creatures you control and just double up on their +1/+1 counters, which just scales incredibly well with both our commander and all of the value creatures we're playing in this deck. Voracious Hydra, when this creature enters the battlefield, you get to pick one out of two options. The first option will just double the amount of counters it enters the battlefield with, making it enter as twice as big of a threat, and the second option will make it fight target creature you don't control, which essentially does make it act as some sort of a spot removal tool, because once your Zimone is online and you do have the cost reduction, you can use this effect to just destroy about anything. Mutagen Man, a 2 mana X cost creature that won't enter the battlefield with any counters, but instead it will generate you X mutagen tokens. Mutagen tokens being artifacts you can sacrifice for 1 generic mana on sorcery speed to put 1 +1/+1 counter on any creature. And thanks to the passive ability of Mutagen Man, you will be able to crack these mutagen tokens for 0 mana, allowing you to cast them for a massive amount of mana thanks to Zimone, and you can then either use these mutagen tokens to stack additional counters on Zimone, getting even more cost reduction, or you can even stack additional counters on your big beatstick creatures to just take over the game with them. Tervigon, an X cost trample creature that whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent will generate you that many 1/1 Tyranid tokens. Not only will you get a massive trample beatstick whenever you cast this, but whenever it does deal combat damage, it will also provide you with a massive amount of tokens. So instead of this deck just going tall by buffing the stats of our creatures with +1/+1 counters, thanks to Tervigon, this deck can also go wide and generate you a gazillion creature bodies. If your opponents have no way to deal with this creature, the board state will just start scaling out of control. And this card also has the Ravenous mechanic, meaning that whenever you cast it with X being greater than 5, it will also draw you a card, just replacing itself. Primordial Hydra, a simple 2-drop creature that at the beginning of your upkeep will just double the amount of +1/+1 counters it has on itself. And you can sort of compare this card to a Neff or a Colonian Hydra. It's a big trample creature body that will just keep scaling up and up and up over the course of the game, and if your opponents aren't able to deal with it, they will just lose the game against it. And especially thanks to us running this many protection and counter spells, we will easily be able to keep it on the board. You can even drop it really early in the game to just get a free Zimone trigger and make it enter with 1 counter. For as long as it does stick around, it will just keep growing. Blue Sun's Twilight. Escalate. For 2 blue mana plus X on sorcery speed, we get to gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If the value we paid for the X is 5 or more, we also get to generate a token copy of that creature. And just like I mentioned when I was talking about Dominate, this card functions as some sort of an improved removal spell, because you won't just be destroying a creature, you will be taking it away from an opponent and you will be able to use it yourself. And especially thanks to our Zimone's cost reduction, it will be really easy to meet the 5 cost requirement and get the additional token copy. Just imagine casting this card on your opponent's Ancient Copper Dragon or their Ashen Rider and you just gaining control of it and even getting an additional token copy in the process. Total value blowout. And the last card in this section is an Altered Ego, which thanks to Zimone's cost reduction is a 2 mana version of Clone. Now, like I already mentioned, we can't really use any clone spells in this deck because most of our creatures have a base toughness of 0. But this card really is the exception to that rule, because it will enter the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on itself, meaning you can use it to get an additional copy of any of the value creatures in this deck like a Goldvein Hydra, a Primordial Hydra, or your Voracious Hydra, and thanks to Zimone's cost reduction, it will actually enter with a massive amount of counters. And finally, we have our mana base. For this list, I will be using the high-end optimized version, but if you want to make the deck a little more accessible, in the Moxfield Primer, I also included some budget land swaps. And since we're playing a small amount of utility lands, I'll start by going over those. Alchemist Refuge and Emergence Zone. Both are lands that will tap for 1 colorless mana and have the ability that they do enable us to cast all of our spells on instant speed until the end of turn, which are really nice abilities, especially on something as simple as some lands that will enable us during the late game to get those additional Zimone triggers and get extra counters on her. Boseiju Who Endures, a legendary land that enters the battlefield untapped and just taps for 1 green mana, already making it function as some sort of a basic forest that doesn't really have any downsides to including in the deck. Now, what makes this card this pricey is the fact that it has the channel ability. For just 1 green mana, you get to destroy either target artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, or non-basic land, giving you an additional tool to deal with any problematic card on the battlefield while not really having any downsides. And one of the coolest things about channeling is the fact that it is an activated ability, and your opponents won't be able to use any counter magic to stop this effect from happening. And obviously, we're also playing the blue channel land, Otawara, Soaring City, which now that I think about it really looks like a Star Destroyer. And just like a Boseiju, it will enter the battlefield untapped and tap for a blue mana. This time the channel ability will allow us on instant speed to bounce any target planeswalker, enchantment, artifact, or creature. Another really good interaction tool in our kit that might just change the outcome of the game by bouncing that one really relevant permanent. Now, just like I mentioned, the channel lands are really expensive and you don't really need them for the deck. The deck will still function totally fine if you do replace these 2 channel lands with just basic lands. And for the regular mana producing lands, we're playing 3 fetch lands, a shock land, a fast land, a dual face land, a slow land, a Dryad Arbor to go fetch up with our Green Sun Zenith, a Plaza of Heroes, a check land, a filter land, a Mistrise Village, a Horizon land, a Bond land, a Verge land, a Pain land, a Yavimaya, a Command Tower, a City of Brass, a Mana Confluence, and for basics we're playing 6 forests and 4 islands. And that's it for my Zimone Infinite Analyst deck. A commander that turns every X spell you cast into a scaling cost reduction and is nearly impossible to interact with. Once Zimone gets going, you're not just casting big spells. You'll be casting them for barely any mana, drawing a ton of cards, and protecting your entire engine at the same time. It's an incredibly unique and explosive playstyle and definitely one of the more complex builds I've ever did. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a brain emoji in the comments below. Share this video with anyone you know that purchased the Quandrix Precon, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's video. Thanks for watching, remember that X gon' give it to ya, and I'll see you in the next one.